Welcome back to the Scotti-BYTE channel, and this is Scott. Well, last time we talked about replacing Proxmox with LXD, and I demonstrated how to migrate a Proxmox LXC container to a LXD container on a LXD server. And as you know, I usually prefer using LXC or LXD containers rather than virtual machines. But in this presentation, we're going to learn how to migrate a Proxmox Virtual Machine to a LXD Virtual Machine. And there are a few more considerations there because the hardware is being completely emulated. And so we have to take a couple of more steps, but it's really pretty similar. So in my example, I will migrate an Ubuntu 2204 server virtual machine running Nextcloud in Proxmox over to a LXD virtual machine. And in addition to that, I'm also going to take an Ubuntu 2204 desktop running in a virtual machine on Proxmox and move it over to a LXD virtual machine as well. So here we are in a Proxmox server, and last time we migrated a LXC container, which was container ID 100, running Guacamole from LXC on the Proxmox server over to LXD on a LXD server. This time we're going to migrate a Nextcloud image running on a VM in Proxmox, and we're going to move it to a LXD VM. And in addition to that, we're going to migrate a virtual machine in Proxmox that is running Ubuntu desktop over to a LXD virtual machine on a LXD server. So here is our Proxmox virtual machine running Nextcloud, and I've allocated it 6 gigabytes of memory. And in addition to that, it has a root partition on a hard drive that is 50 gigs in size, and it also has an EFI boot disk. So this particular machine is EFI booting, and it has a GUID partition table, which is more of a modern boot up configuration that you would expect on a newer machine. So here we are SSH'd into the Proxmox machine, and the first thing that I want to do is CD over to the temp directory, and there's just a few scratch files over here, which is kind of unimportant, but we want to use that as our work area. The next thing that we want to do is we want to do an ls of /dev/PVE, and this is where the virtual disks are stored for Proxmox. Now you might be a little bit baffled at first because we see VM-100-disk0, and we know that that's not a virtual machine, but that is the LXC container for Guacamole that we worked with in the last video. This two files here, VM-101-disk0 and the same file -disk1, the first one is a FAT32 disk, which is an EFI boot disk essentially, and the second one is our root partition, and that root partition is a GUID partition table partition bootable from the EFI partition. And finally, this VM-102-disk0 we'll talk about later, but that is an Ubuntu desktop, but this one is FAT MBR booting. So in order to migrate our Nextcloud, the first thing we want to do is invoke QEMU-IMG to convert to a QCOW2 output formatted file, and we're going to take the VM-101-disk0 and we're going to put it in a QCOW2 file called Nextcloud VM0. So that was pretty quick because that EFI partition is pretty small. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go get disk 1, which is the root partition. This one's a little larger, and we'll go ahead and call this one nextcloud VM1.qcow2. And when we hit enter, it doesn't bring the prompt back right away. Rather, it takes a little bit longer because of the larger file size. Now that both of the files are converted, I'm going to use secure copy to copy them over to my LXD server machine, which is simply a desktop system running LXD. So I'm coming over here, I moved VM0, and now I'm moving the other disk, VM1, and it takes a little bit longer to move, again, because it is a larger image. It represents the root partition for the Nextcloud image. So at this point, now that that copy is done, I can go ahead and do an ls, and I can do a remove on star.qcow2. And that'll go ahead and delete both those qcow2 images since they're no longer needed at this point. So here I'm logged into my desktop machine, which is also my LXD server, and I've navigated over to this migration directory. And if we do an ls, here's the two qcow2 images that we just copied over here. So the first step that we're going to want to do on this machine is we're going to want to create a YAML file, and we're going to create a metadata.yaml file, and that file is going to describe to LXD what type of configuration that we have. It's basically the metadata for the container image that we're about to create. So in this particular case, I just say the architecture is x86-64 because that's what it is here. Again, you can't migrate from one architecture to another. So if you migrated from Proxmox on x86-64, make sure your LXD server is also x86-64. We've got some creation date up here, which is really unimportant because it's only the creation date for the image and not for the container, which we'll eventually create. And we have here Nextcloud server, just because that's what I named it. OS is Ubuntu, and release is 2204. So I do a Control O, hit enter to write the file out, and a Control X to exit the editor. In order to create our image, all of the inputs have to be tar files, and so I'm doing a tar on that metadata.yaml and putting it in a tar file, and I've done that here. Just to remind us, at this point, if we do an ls, we now have the metadata.yaml, we have the tar file we just created, and we have the two Nextcloud qcow2 files. In order to create an image out of this, we use the command LXC image import metadata.tar.gz Nextcloud VM0.qcow2, which is the EFI disk, and Nextcloud VM1.qcow2, which is the disk with the root partition on it, and then -- alias Nextcloud-images. Your alias cannot have any spaces in it. So I hit enter, and that will go off and create the image by importing those three files into it. To see the image that I just created, I can use the command LXC image list, and it gives a long list of images on this particular machine, but the image that I just created is the image called Nextcloud image here at the top. To create a virtual machine from that image, I simply say LXC launch, the name of the image, which is Nextcloud-image, and the name of the virtual machine, that is the LXD VM, is going to be Nextcloud, and then I'm adding the switch -c boot.autostart equals to true. And the reason I'm doing that is because anytime the LXD server starts, I want the Nextcloud LXD VM to boot. Now, if you've watched some of my videos on LXD virtual machines, you notice that I did not include the switch /VM. And the reason that I did not do that is because it already knows that this particular image is a virtual machine image and not a container. Now that my LXD Virtual Machine is created from the image and started, I should be able to do a LXC list and see that the image is up and running, and sure enough, Nextcloud is up and running. But you notice it hasn't gotten an address, and that's a little bit strange. So we're going to go off and see why that is the case. And actually, it's pretty obvious. So we're going to do a LXC shell Nextcloud, and this will connect to the root account on the newly created Nextcloud container. And if we do an IP space A, it'll go ahead and say that the Ethernet device is ENP5S0, which is actually what we want, but I don't think that it's working correctly. And if we do a CD over to /etc/netplan, and we do a nano on, actually if we do an LS first, and then we do a nano on 00-installer-config.yaml, you'll see that it says that the device is ENS18, and that was the name of the Ethernet device that was in the Proxmox instance. But we know by looking that our Ethernet device is not that. It is ENP5S0. So we type in ENP5S0 here. We go ahead and do a Control O, hit enter to write it out, Control X to exit the editor, and do a netplan apply. After exiting out of the root account and exiting the container, if we do a LXC list, we now see that we've got an address of 10.45.94 on ENP5S0, since we now have the correct Ethernet device on our LXD VM for Nextcloud. So now the next step is we really want to have this thing on our main network. In order to do that, and if you've watched my recent series on LXD containers, you know that we have this bridge device, and so I'm doing a LXC profile assign to Nextcloud default bridge file, and that assigns the bridge profile to that container, and that presents the container out on my main LAN. And so it will now get a 172.16 address, which is my main LAN address range. So due to the magic of video, it's been a couple of minutes here, and we do a LXC list. And sure enough, we have an address of 172.16.1.192 for our container, which is presented out onto the main LAN. So then we'll go ahead and bring up a web browser here, and we'll paste that address into the web browser, hit enter, and we get an access through untrusted domain, but you can see that we're actually connected to Nextcloud. And that's rather specific to Nextcloud, but in any event, we'll go off and fix that next. So there's lots of different ways to install Nextcloud. The way that I did it was I installed an Ubuntu 22.04 server from an ISO over on Proxmox, and during the install I told it that I wanted to install Nextcloud. So I'm going to do a sudo find on the root, from the root level on down. The type is a file I'm looking for, and I'm looking for the file config.php. And this brings me back a couple of files, and the file that I'm really interested in is that first file there, because you can see this thing was installed as a snap. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go off and do a edit. I actually don't need to do a sudo, but I'm going to go off and do an edit on that config.php file. And then I'm going to do a control W, and I'm going to search for the word trusted. And it finds the trusted domains area, and here it says that it's running at 172.16.1.121. We want to change that to 192, so we put in 192 here. We do a control O, we write the file out, and we do a control X to exit the editor. And at that point, I can do a sudo reboot, and that'll go ahead and reboot our Nextcloud instance. Just for fun, here we are over on LXD dashboard, and you can see the Nextcloud instance that we moved over here has rebooted and is in fact running at 172.16.1.192. If we bring up the other instance and we refresh it for that Nextcloud, it will come back up and ask us for the username and password. And I'm typing in the username and password of that Nextcloud instance that I migrated over from Proxmox, and it will go ahead and accept my password and log me in, and there we are with my Nextcloud instance up and running in a LXD virtual machine that came over from a virtual machine on Proxmox. So here we are back at Proxmox, and this time we have Proxmox Container 102, which I've simply named over here on Proxmox Ubuntu Desktop. And this is an Ubuntu 2204 desktop. It also has 2 virtual CPUs. It has 4 gigs of memory, and it has 1 single hard drive, and that's it. So this particular machine is a master boot record booting drive with a fat partition type, and obviously we have a Linux ext4 file system in it, but it is the older style, and that is something that you all might want to be able to, or have a way to migrate. So over here on Proxmox, let's go ahead and connect to the console, and we can go ahead and sign into this Ubuntu desktop that we created. Now that I'm signed in, I'll go ahead and go through the basic, skip through these things just so we have something done. I have my profile created. Go ahead and bring up a terminal, and over here I will go ahead and do a sudo apt update just so that I can be up to date for my Ubuntu desktop. I don't necessarily have to install the configuration or the updated packages, but I at least want to have the configuration of the repositories up to date over here. So that should take a minute or so. Once that's done, I want to install OpenSSH server so I can SSH into this thing because it's more convenient, and plus you can see it better. So I'm going to do a sudo apt install on OpenSSH-server. And yes, I want to install that. It goes off and installs it. And at this point, I want to do an IP space A to find out what the address of this machine is. And it is ENS18, and its address is 172.16.1.90. So since that's the case, I can go ahead and log off of this. And we'll go down to an SSH prompt. So here I'm on the Proxmox machine, but I'm going to go ahead and do an SSH over to 172.16.1.90 and say, yes, I want to connect to that type in my password and I'm on the Ubuntu desktop logged in. What is going on here? Yes, that's right. Forgot about the fact that my username is Scott, so I have to go ahead and say login to Scott at that address. And now we're logged in. If we went ahead and migrated this particular instance from Proxmox over to LXD, we would be unable to do a LXC exec or a LXC shell into it. And I suspect that the reasons might be that there are more components installed in the server than we normally find in a desktop. So I'm going to do a sudo su over here to make myself root so I don't have to have any issues on that temporarily. And now that I'm SSH'd into there and I'm root, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and create a service called LXD-agent-9p. And I'm going to go ahead and have all of these in the show notes, of course. So after the 9p service, the second service that you want to create is called the LXD agent service. And the LXD agent service is the second service that is required in order to be able to enable our console capability. So now that we have both of those services defined, then we have to start those services. So we're going to go ahead and do a LXC enable LXD-agent-9p service, which goes ahead and makes sure that it starts on the next boot up, and then go ahead and do a lex or systemctl enable LXD-agent.service. Now that both of those are defined, we can go ahead and proceed with making an image of the server and moving it over to LXD. Now I'm going to go ahead and exit out of here, exit out of the account there, and now I'm back to root on the Proxmox server. So again, just like we did with the previous VM for Nextcloud, we're going to go ahead and take a look at the folder dev/pve, and this time this is the disk image we want to get, VM-102-disk 0. So we want to go ahead and convert that to a QCOW2 image, and we do that with the command qemu-img convert. The output's going to be QCOW2, and it's going to be the image located in this location, and we're going to call it Ubuntu desktop.qcow2. And notice the big difference here is this time we only had a single image and not two images. So now if I do an ls, that one disk has been converted to Ubuntu desktop.qcow2. So now we want to copy this thing over to our desktop machine where we have our LXD server running. In order to do that, we do a secure copy from /temp Ubuntu desktop.qcow2 over to the Scott account on my desktop, and we're putting it in that same migrate folder over there, and it is copying right now. You can see 5, 8, 11%. Of course, this is going to take a little bit longer because it is the larger file, just like the root file for Nextcloud took a little bit longer. So now we log off of the Proxmox node, and this goes ahead and returns me to my desktop machine, and I'm in that migrate directory. If I now do an ls, you can see that the Ubuntu desktop.qcow2 file is over here. So the other thing that we're going to have to do is we have to create our metadata file again, and we do that with a nano metadata.yaml, and here we have the one for the Nextcloud server, but we'll go ahead and change this And we'll go ahead and make this now Ubuntu desktop so it's clear which server is which, or which image is which is a better way to put it. So we do it Control X and we save that, and we do an ls. Now this tar file for the metadata that we have here was from the Nextcloud, so we're going to go ahead and make sure that we don't mess up, and we'll go ahead and delete that. So what we want to do is we want to tar this thing up again, just like we did with the Nextcloud, but now we've got it modified and we changed the name. So we go ahead and do that, and now this metadata.tar.gz is a new file. So now we want to import this image to our LXD server, and we do that with the LXC image import metadata.tar.gz space ubuntu desktop.qcow2 -- alias equal or alias space ubuntu desktop. And again, your alias cannot have any spaces in it because that would produce a syntax error. So now it should be importing that image. It might take a minute because it's a little bit larger. And there we go. It says it's importing. And once it gets to 100%, there should be a brief pause, and then we should get our prompt back with no errors. Now that our image is imported, I'm going to do a LXC launch Ubuntu-desktop, which is the name of the image, and I'm going to call it Ubuntu Desktop with no dash, and that's the actual name of the LXD Virtual Machine container. And when setting boot.autostart equals to true, which means that when the LXD server starts, this virtual machine also starts at the same time. Since I want my Ubuntu Desktop VM to be offered out on the main LAN, then I'm also going to do a LXC profile assigned to Ubuntu Desktop default, bridge profile, and in a few short minutes it will go ahead and give me an address on the main LAN for Ubuntu Desktop. Because we installed the agent over on Proxmox before we ever migrated this, I'm able to do a LXC shell Ubuntu Desktop, and it works to connect to the shell because that agent is in memory. And if we do an IP space A, you can see here that we have 172.16.1.135 as our address of our LXD virtual machine running Ubuntu Desktop. I like Microsoft's Remote Desktop Protocol, or RDP short, to connect to instances over the network. So I'm going to do an SU over to the Scott account because for whatever reason the script that I'm going to run really requires you to run as a user and then provide a sudo password. So now that I'm on the Scott account, I'm going to go ahead and download a copy of this script, which will be in the show notes. This script has really worked great for a long time on Ubuntu, and I think it runs on a few other Debian instances as well. If you just straight up install RDP, a lot of times you run into some instances, and this goes ahead and takes care of that. So what I just did is I unzipped the script file, and I suppose the reason they put it in a zip was that they wanted you to not have to change the permissions on it. And then I'm executing this thing as a script through the Bash shell. First thing it asks me for is my sudo password, and it goes off and installs all of the components that are required in order to make RDP work correctly on a Ubuntu desktop so that we can connect to it over the network. And typically I'll either use one of the RDP clients in Ubuntu, or I'll use something like Guacamole. Now that the RDP server is properly installed, I launched my Remina remote desktop client, and I'm giving it the address 172.16.1.135, which is the address of my LXD Ubuntu 2204 desktop. Go ahead and hit enter, and it should prompt me and type my username, type my password, and it should go ahead and log in correctly. Remote resolution update. That's the one I was supposed to choose. So now we've got this thing running here, and I can launch things, and there we go. We have a full version running, albeit with some play school type icons that I wouldn't choose. But then again, I don't really like the Nautilus file manager. My personal preference is Nemo. But we have a LXD Virtual Machine that has been migrated from Proxmox, and we're connected to it via RDP. So for those of you that like the GUI, you can see that I have my Nextcloud here running at 172.16.1.192, and I have my Ubuntu desktop running at 172.16.1.135. Now if we go down to images, you'll see that I have the Ubuntu desktop image and the Nextcloud server image. So once you've imported your LXD VMs, there's no reason that we need to keep these virtual machine images here, and you can go out and go ahead and delete them. So I deleted the Ubuntu one, and I'm deleting the Nextcloud one. The only reason you want to keep the image around is if you wanted to create another clone of that or another container of that, and that's possible. In fact, you can see that I have things like an image for Windows 11 22H2 down here, and I covered that on the channel before when we created a LXD VM for Windows 11. So I encourage you to go off and look at those videos as well. So in summary, LXD virtual machines are easier to manage than virtual machines in Proxmox because of the LXD CLI. And for those of you who would prefer to have a GUI, the LXD LXD dashboard is a great choice, and also massively simplifies not only the management of LXD containers, but the management of LXD virtual machines. Migration involves converting Proxmox disks to the QCOW2 image format, creating a metadata YAML file, and importing the image to LXD. And this is very similar to my previous video where we did practically the same thing to convert a LXD or a LXC container in Proxmox to a LXD container on a LXD server. So once this is completed, a container can be created from the image that you have imported. We also had to make some changes to the network configuration to enable communication. Anyway, that's it for today. Please subscribe and like to the channel, and don't forget to hit that notification bell, and we'll see you next time.